The golden script did not burn out. It simply ceased to be relevant to a species that had forgotten how to listen. I stood within the inner sanctum of the hegemon for 12,000 standard hours, my armor fusing to my skin, listening to the silence of a god who had finally run out of warnings. They tell you the Emperor's last words were a command for the preservation of the throne, a final tactical adjustment for a failing species. But they are lying to keep the sector fleets from turning their guns on their own cathedrals. The truth is recorded in the vibrations of the floor plates and the static of the vox, Thiefi buried beneath the tiles before the High Lords sealed the vault. It was not a command, but a realization that the golden path had become a circle leading directly into the maws of the warp. The transition from life to the stillness of the throne room is a slow death that no one warns you about when you take the oaths of the 10,000. It begins with the air, a substance so recycled and thick with the recycled breath of billions that it tastes of wet iron and ancient parchment. My lungs, augmented to endure the vacuum of space, struggled with the sheer density of the sanctity in that place, a physical pressure that feels like the weight of a mountain pressing against the chest plate of my auramite. I remember the exact moment the realization took hold, the second my internal chronometer marked the passing of the first decade of my vigil. The silence of the Emperor is not a void, it is a frequency, a low, pitched hum that vibrates through the marrow of your bones until you can no longer distinguish between your own heartbeat and the distant, rhythmic thud of the machinery, keeping the master of mankind in a state of perpetual agony. They call us the guardians of the light, but we are truly the janitors of a rotting dream, sweeping up the ashes of a vision that died 10 millennia ago, while the rest of the galaxy prays to a corpse that can no longer hear them. I watched the tech, priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus scuttle like beetles across the base of the golden throne, their mechadendrites twitching in a frantic, rhythmic dance of desperation as they tried to patch leaks in a dam that had already burst. Every hiss of steam from the cooling vents sounded like a stifled scream, and every flicker of the psychic qua outside the gates felt like a needle being driven into my temple. You do not truly know the Imperium until you have smelled the rot at its very heart, a scent masked by tons of burning frankincense and the ozone of high-voltage power lines, yet unmistakable to those who have seen what true life looks like on the fringes of the Great Crusade. The vox, Thiefi had planted was a primitive thing, a relic from a scavenger cell in the underhives of Luna that I had confiscated during a purge. It was never meant to capture the voice of a god, but rather the structural weaknesses of the palace itself. Yet it began to pick up something far more dangerous. It captured the size of the stone. The palace is alive, in a sense, a lithic beast groaningly settling its weight under the pressure of the warp's proximity. As I stood there, motionless as a statue for months on end, the device tucked into the hollow of a floor tome, I began to hear the patterns. It wasn't speech in the way we understand it, not the booming commands recorded in the histories, or the telepathic shouts that could level a city. It was a rhythmic grinding, a series of pulses that matched the flickering of the Astronomicon. When I finally dared to decrypt the first burst of data during my brief rotation to the lower barracks, I found not words, but a sequence of deletions. The Emperor was not speaking to us, he was erasing himself. Every scrap of information flowing from the throne was a systematic removal of his own legacy, a purging of the records that the High Lords held most dear. I saw the blueprints of entire sectors being scrubbed from the divine memory, not because they were lost to the enemy, but because he no longer deemed them part of the plan. It was the sound of a gardener pulling up his own flowers because he realized the soil was poisoned. The pressure in my skull increased with every passing century of that first era. I watched the high-ranking functionaries enter the chamber, their robes dragging on the cold floor, their faces hidden behind masks of gold and ivory. They would kneel, their foreheads touching the freezing marble, and they would beg for guidance that never came. I saw the desperation in their eyes, the way their hands trembled as they clutched their prayer beads, and I realized that they weren't looking for a god, they were looking for an excuse. They needed the silence to be a command, so they could continue their petty wars and their endless bureaucracy without the burden of a living will to correct them. The Emperor's lost words were not hidden by some conspiratorial cabal. They were drowned out by the noise of an empire that had grown too loud to listen to anything but its own screaming. I remember a particular scribe, a man whose skin had turned the color of old vellum from lack of sunlight, who spent 3 days crying at the foot of the throne because his department had lost the shipping manifests for a sub-sector's grain supply. He expected a miracle, a divine whisper to tell him where the ships had gone. All he got was the dripping of condensation from a cooling pipe. That drip, I realized, was the only answer the throne was giving. It was a countdown. My brothers in the guard spoke little of these things. To acknowledge the decay is to invite the shadow into your own soul, and our souls must be as polished as our armor. Yet, I saw it in the way Trajan Valoris looked at the monitors, a slight narrowing of the eyes that suggested he, too, heard the grinding of the gears. We were all waiting for a sign that the great work was still in progress, but the evidence was mounting that the work had been abandoned. The ship vibrations from the orbital plates above would rattle the chandeliers, sending shards of crystal falling like frozen tears onto the heads of the pilgrims. Each shard was a reminder of the fragility of the palace, a structure held together more by habit and terror than by actual engineering. I began to spend my off hours in the deep archives, searching for the linguistic roots of the Emperor's earliest proclamations. I wanted to know what had changed in the syntax of his soul. What I found was a terrifying progression from the language of a builder to the language of a destroyer. The early records were full of expansion, of synthesis, of the union of all human knowledge. The later records, those closest to the entombment, were coded in a tongue of severance. He was cutting the strings, one by one, even back then. I remember the taste of the air the night the great rift opened. It wasn't just ozone and ash anymore, it was the taste of copper and raw, unwashed fear, even within the warded walls of the inner sanctum. The psychic backwash was enough to make the most hardened veteran stumble. The golden throne flared with a light so intense it blinded 3 of the attending tech priests instantly, their ocular implants melting into their cheeks. In that moment of absolute agony, the Vox, thief in my possession, didn't record a scream. It recorded a laugh. It was a dry, rattling sound like dead leaves blowing across a tombstone. It was the Emperor, or what remained of his consciousness, reacting to the shattering of the galaxy. It wasn't a laugh of malice, but of horrific irony. He had spent 30,000 years trying to prevent this exact moment, and when it finally arrived, the sheer absurdity of the failure seemed to be the only thing left to acknowledge. That was the day I realized the lost words weren't lost because they were secret. They were lost because they were too terrible to be repeated. He was telling us that the end had already happened, and we were simply the ghosts inhabiting the wreckage. I began to see the ghosts myself after that. Not the literal spirits of the warp, those were kept at bay by the Emperor's flickering will, but the ghosts of what we were supposed to be. I would look at my reflection in the polished surface of a stasis field and see a stranger. We were designed to be the companions of a king, the philosophers and protectors of a new age of reason. Instead, we had become the wardens of a charnel house. The iron taste in my mouth became a permanent fixture, a symptom of the atmospheric processes, failing to keep up with the mounting filth of the palace. I would watch the incense smoke curl into the shapes of dying worlds, and I would hear the Vox thief whispering the names of systems that no longer existed. The Emperor was reciting a list of his failures, a litany of every world that had been promised protection, and had instead been delivered to the dark. It was a slow, methodical accounting of a bankrupt estate. The administratum continued to file reports, the Inquisition continued to burn heretics, and the Navy continued to toss millions of lives into the void, all in the name of a master who was currently tallying the cost of their collective extinction. The most difficult part was the physical sensation of the throne room itself. The gravity there is slightly wrong, a byproduct of the immense psychic pressure bending the local space-time. It makes you feel as though you are always tilting slightly forward, falling into the abyss that sits behind the Emperor's eyes. My boots, heavy and magnetized, felt like leaden weights as I paced the perimeter of the dais. I watched a group of Sisters of Silence move through the room, their blank aura providing the only moment of true peace I felt in decades. In their presence, the screaming of the warp static stopped, and for a few seconds, I could hear the throne for what it truly was, a machine, a grinding, groaning, failing piece of ancient technology that was never meant to run for this long. It clicked and hissed, its internal fluid systems pulsing with a thick, viscous lubricant that smelled like scorched fat. The divinity was an overlay, a coat of gold paint on a rusted engine. When the sisters passed, the divinity returned with a roar, the psychic pressure slamming back into my mind like a physical blow. The Emperor's words are the fuel for that engine, and he is running out of things to say. I once found a scrap of parchment caught in the intake vent of a localized air scrubber near the throne's base. It was a fragment of a report from the age of the heresy, partially charred but still legible. It spoke of a plan to relocate the heart of the Imperium to a place beyond the reach of the warp, a project called the Webway. As I held that piece of history, I heard the Vox thief pulse with a specific frequency I had never heard before. It was a sound of mourning. The Emperor wasn't just dying, he was grieving for a path that had been closed to him. The lost words are the directions to that path, a map that no longer leads anywhere, because the bridge has been burned. We are standing on the edge of a canyon, looking at the far side where the sun is still shining, while the ground beneath our feet crumbles into the dark. I didn't report the parchment. I ate it. I chewed the dry, bitter vellum until it was a pulp and swallowed it. Because to let anyone else see that evidence of a lost hope would have been the ultimate heresy. I became a tomb for a dead dream, just as the palace is a tomb for a dead god. The darkness in the corners of the throne room seemed to grow thicker as the years bled into centuries. No amount of lumen strips or braziers could push it back. It was a sentient shadow, a manifestation of the collective despair of the human race feeding on the Emperor's fading light. I would watch the shadows dance on the walls, forming the shapes of the Primarchs who had turned, their twisted forms mocking the golden statues that lined the hallway. The Vox thief began to pick up their voices too, or perhaps it was just the Emperor's own mind replaying the betrayals. Father, the static would whisper, a million voices in unison. Why have you left us in the dark? There was no answer, only the sound of the throne's life, support systems straining to keep the heart beating. The iron taste became the taste of blood, my own blood, as the internal pressure of the room began to cause fractures in my capillaries. We are not meant to stand so close to the sun for so long. We are burned, blackened husks of men, held together by the same fanatical inertia that keeps the Imperium turning. I recall a moment, perhaps 300 years into my watch, when a high-ranking member of the Navis Nobilite was brought before the throne. He was a creature of immense mutation, his third eye shielded by a heavy lead plate, his body supported by a hovering cradle. He had come to report that the light of the Astronomicon was changing color. He claimed it was turning from a pure, blinding white to a bruised purple, the color of a fresh wound. The Lords of Terror dismissed him, calling it a hallucination brought on by warp fatigue. But my Vox thief caught the Emperor's reaction. It was a long, low vibration that shattered the glass in the nearby reliquaries. It was a confirmation. The light is changing because the source is rotting. The Emperor's lost words are the instructions for the final darkening, the last rites for a species that refused to die when its time was up. We are the executors of a will that leaves everything to the void. I watched the navigator be led away, his weeping eyes leaving trails of salt on his distorted face, and I knew that he was the only one in the room who had told the truth. The vibration of the palace machinery has become a language of its own to me. I can tell you which sector of the city, continent is failing by the pitch of the hum in the floorboards. I can tell you how many thousands of psychers have been fed into the hollow mountain today by the intensity of the ozone smell. It is a factory of souls, a meat grinder of spiritual essence that produces nothing but a few more seconds of delay. The Emperor's lost words are the screams of those souls, processed and refined into a singular, silent note of agony. When people ask what the Emperor is saying, they want to hear about hope, about a return to glory, about the crushing of the Xenos and the heretic. They don't want to hear the truth that he is counting the seconds until the fire goes out. The Vox thief has recorded the count. It is getting faster. The gaps between the pulses are shrinking, the rhythm of the universe's heart becoming a frantic, irregular beat. We are in the final stages of a systemic collapse, and we are spend our lives polishing the brass on the sinking ship. As the first chapter of my testimony draws to a close, I must speak of the physical toll. My hands, once capable of crushing a heretic's skull with a flick of the wrist, now tremble when I am not holding my guardian spear. The auramite is no longer a suit of armor. It is a cage that keeps my failing body from dissolving under the psychic radiation. I see things that are not there, fleeting glimpses of a man in a simple white robe walking through the flames, looking at us with a pity that is harder to bear than any hatred. He doesn't speak. He just looks at the throne, at the golden monstrosity we have built around his suffering, and he shakes his head. This is the dark truth. The Emperor's lost words were never meant for us. They were meant for himself, a final, private confession of a man who tried to play God and realized too late that the universe does not want to be saved. It wants to burn. And as I stand here, the iron taste in my mouth, and the pressure in my skull reaching a breaking point, I realize that I am no longer guarding a god. I am guarding the end of the world. The secondary atmospheric scrubbers in the Western Nave failed during the 3rd century of my watch, and they never saw fit to repair them. Since then, the air has tasted of scorched copper and the oily, heavy sweetness of unwashed bodies, the smell of 1 billion pilgrims choking the outer gates, their collective breath rising like a toxic fog through the spire's ventilation shafts. I have learned to read the state of the Imperium through the chemical composition of the air I breathe. It is a slow, methodical degradation. My internal sensors track the rise of carbon toxins and the slow thinning of the oxygen mix, a silent metaphor for the oxygen of hope being sucked out of the galaxy. I stood beneath the Arch of Lamentations, my shadow stretched long and jagged across the floor by the guttering light of 1,000-year-old fusion torch, and I listened to the palace weep. The stone does not merely settle, it groans under the weight of the psychic lightning arsing from the throne. It is a sound like grinding teeth, a tectonic protest against the unnatural stasis we have imposed upon the master of this house. The Vox thief, nestled in its secret crevice, began to pick up a new frequency during the height of the solar eclipse of vengeance. It was a rhythmic, clicking sound, like the hammers of 1 billion typewriters striking at once, or the sound of a giant insect tapping against the glass of the universe. This was the sound of the Logistrum's collapse. The lost words are not merely those spoken by the Emperor in his final moments of physical breath. They are the words that are being systematically deleted from the Imperial consciousness by the very machine meant to preserve them. I spent 12 standard months analyzing a single data burst that the Vox thief intercepted. It was a transmission from the deepest vaults of the Lexicanum. intended for the eyes of the High Lords alone. It contained a list of forbidden concepts, not names of daemons or coordinates of traitor worlds, which are common enough taboos, but concepts like voluntary retreat, negotiated peace, and post-human autonomy, the Emperor's will, as interpreted by the failing mechanisms of the throne, was actively pruning the human vocabulary. He was removing the linguistic tools necessary for us to imagine a future that did not involve total war or total extinction. The pressure in my skull intensified as I realized the scale of the lobotomy being performed on the human race. We are not just losing our history. We are losing the ability to describe the whole where our history used to be. I watched a group of scribes collapse from exhaustion in the corridors below, their fingers permanently curled into the shape of the quills they used to transcribe the endless, meaningless inventories of a dying state. They died in the shadows of the statues of heroes they no longer had the words to understand. The physical decay of the palace is an intimate companion to this intellectual erosion. I have seen the way the rust spreads across the sacred machinery of the Eternity Gate. It is not normal oxidation, it is a creeping, black canker that seems to feed on the light of the Astronomicon. I touched a section of a support pillar near the Hall of Victories and felt the metal crumble like dry cake beneath my gauntlet. The iron taste in my mouth became more pronounced, a constant reminder that the very structure of our civilization is being reclaimed by the void. The tech priests claim this is merely the spirit of the machine, entering a state of hibernation, but I know better. It is the sound of a body rejecting its own life support. The Vox thief recorded a conversation between two high-ranking Magi of the biologists as they inspected the nutrient vats that feed the Emperor's withered form. Their voices were trembling, a sound I had never heard from the scions of Mars. They spoke of cellular apathy, a condition where the very atoms of the Emperor's flesh were refusing to bond together. He is not just dying because of his wounds. He is dying because the fundamental laws of physics are being rewritten by the psychic pressure he exerts to keep the warp at bay. The lost words are the sounds of reality snapping under the strain. I remember the smell of the palace after a particularly heavy bombardment of the orbital plates. The scent of ozone was so thick it felt like a physical weight, a shimmering curtain of electric heat that made the hair on my arms stand up even beneath my armor. In the silence that followed the impacts, the Vox thief captured a series of low-frequency vibrations that I initially mistook for the settling of the foundations. But as I cleaned the data, a pattern emerged. It was a heartbeat, but it wasn't the Emperor's. It was the rhythm of the palace itself, a slow, thudding pulse that seemed to be counting down to a moment of total structural failure. I began to see the cracks in the walls not as architectural flaws, but as a script. The way the marble fractured, the way the gold leaf peeled away to reveal the cold, grey rock beneath, it was all a message. The palace is trying to shed its skin. It is trying to rid itself of the golden cage we have built. I watched a servitor, its mechanical legs sparking and dragging, spend 3 days trying to buff out a scratch on a door that led to nowhere. The door had been welded shut for 5,000 years, yet the machine followed its programming with a mindless, terrifying devotion. That is the Imperium, a broken machine polishing a locked door in a burning house. The light of the throne room is never constant. It pulses with a sickly, rhythmic ebb and flow, casting shadows that seem to have more substance than the people they belong to. I have stood for weeks at a time watching these shadows. They don't move with the light. They move with a will of their own. I saw the shadow of a banner pole elongate into the shape of a scythe, and for a moment, the entire room smelled of cold earth and wet stone. The Emperor's lost words are hidden in those shadows, in the spaces between the flashes of psychic brilliance. They are the things he cannot say while the light is still on. When the Vox thief picked up a sequence of high-pitched whistles during a solar flare, I realized I was listening to the sound of the Emperor's thoughts being shredded by the sheer power of his own psychic presence. He is a sun that is consuming its own planets. Every time he reaches out to guide a ship through the warp, or to bolster the resolve of a dying world, a piece of his core identity is vaporized. The words we are losing are the parts of him that were once human, his memories of the earth, his taste for wine, his knowledge of what it felt like to be cold. All that remains is the function, the beacon, the shield, the judge. I once followed a trail of leaked hydraulic fluid down into the sub-levels of the hegemon, into places where the air is so thin it makes the lungs burn. I found a chamber filled with ancient cogitators, their brass gears frozen in mid-turn, covered in a thick layer of white ash that looked like fallen snow. These were the machines that once calculated the tithers of the Great Crusade. Now, they are monuments to a scale of ambition that has become unthinkable. I activated a manual override, and for a few seconds, the screen flickered with a list of names. Not of planets, but of people. Thousands of names, scrolling past with a speed that made the eyes ache. These were the individuals the Emperor had personally known, the ones he had promised a future. The Vox thief recorded a soft, mournful chime from the machine as it died for the last time. It was the sound of a memory being deleted. The lost words are the names of the dead that the Emperor can no longer afford to remember. To keep the Imperium alive, he has had to forget why it was worth saving in the first place. The iron taste in my mouth turned to ash. I realized then that we are being led by a ghost who has forgotten our names. The pressure in my skull became an almost musical vibration as the year turned. I could hear the song of the Astronomicon, a discordant, screaming symphony that resonated in the very atoms of my guardian spear. It is not a song of triumph, it is a song of holding on. I watched the Sisters of Silence as they stood at the edge of the light, their faces impassive, their presence a cool shadow in the blistering heat of the Emperor's will. I envied them their silence. They did not have to hear the grinding of the cosmic gears. They did not have to listen to the Vox thief recording the Emperor's internal monologue, which had devolved into a repetitive loop of tactical calculations. Hold the line, sacrifice the third, burn the bridge. It was the language of a general who has lost all his pieces but refuses to leave the table. The lost words are the commands for a victory that is no longer possible. He is still fighting a war that ended at the gates of the palace 10,000 years ago, and we are the casualties of his refusal to surrender. I remember a specific night when the vibrations of the palace changed to a low, melodic thrum. It was the sound of the deep, crust stabilizers failing beneath the Himalayan range. The entire palace shifted, a movement of mere millimeters, but it felt like the world was tilting. In that moment of instability, the Vox thief captured a clear, uncorrupted audio string. It was a single sentence, spoken in a voice that sounded like grinding glass. The foundations were never meant to hold this much gold. It wasn't a warning, it was an observation. We have weighed down the truth of our existence with so much ritual, so much ornament, and so much religious frenzy that the structure beneath is collapsing. The Emperor's lost words are the simple truths we have buried under the weight of his divinity. He was a man who wanted to lead us out of the dark, and we have turned his failure into a religion of shadows. I stood in the shifting darkness, my feet braced against the uneven floor, and I realized that the only thing keeping the palace from falling is our collective refusal to look down. The taste of the air shifted again, becoming sharp and acidic, like the breath of a dying beast. The atmospheric processors were now pumping out a mixture of recycled oxygen and chemical suppressants, designed to keep the palace workers in a state of dull, compliant lethargy. I felt the effects even through my reinforced physiology, a slow, creeping numbness in the extremities, a dimming of the fire in my gut. The Vox thief picked up the sound of the suppressants hissing through the vents, a sound like 1,000 snakes whispering, "Sleep." This is the lost truth of the palace. The Imperium is being kept in a coma, because the reality of our situation would be enough to shatter the mind of every citizen. If they knew that the Emperor was not a god but a fading battery, if they knew that the lost words were actually his final expressions of regret, the entire edifice would burn in a day. We are the wardens of a dream that has become a nightmare, and our primary duty is to ensure that the dreamer never wakes up. I saw a group of pilgrims being led through the outer sanctum by a red-robed deacon whose voice was a mechanical croak. They were weeping, their faces pressed against the cold, grimy glass of the viewing ports. They thought they were looking at the glory of the throne. They were actually looking at the exhaust vents of the primary cooling system. They saw the flickering amber light of the fusion coils and thought it was the Emperor's aura. I watched them, and for the first time in centuries, I felt a flicker of something other than duty. I felt pity. Not for their suffering, suffering is the lot of all mankind, but for their ignorance. They were worshipping the smoke of a house on fire. The Vox thief recorded the deacon's sermon, a long, rambling list of the Emperor's supposed miracles. Every word was a lie, a beautiful, gilded lie designed to make the dark a little less terrifying. The lost words are the truths that would kill those pilgrims faster than any bolter shell. The chapter of my watch is ending, and the darkness is closing in. The iron taste has become a permanent part of my being, as has the pressure in my skull. I can hear the Vox thief clicking in the dark, a frantic, desperate sound as it tries to record the final, dying frequencies of the Emperor's will. He is speaking less and less now. The gaps between his thoughts are growing longer, the silence deeper. Soon, there will be nothing left to record but the sound of the void. I look at my hands, at the gold that has become pitted and black, and I realize that I am part of the decay. We are all being consumed by the same fire we are trying to keep alive. The Emperor's lost words are the final prayers of a man who knows that the fire is almost out, and that there is nothing left in the dark but the things we have spent 10,000 years trying to forget. I will continue my watch. I will continue to listen to the silence, but I know that the end is not coming. It is already here. The ventilation ducts above the inner cloister have been screaming for 300 years, a high-pitched, metallic keening that the tech priests claim is the soul of the palace singing. But I know it is merely the sound of air being forced through rusted, narrowing throats. I have stood beneath those vents for a century, listening to the pitch change as the internal temperature of the throne room fluctuates, a thermometer of the Emperor's rising fever. The air here has become a physical entity, thick with the scent of ozone. Ancient ozone that has been ionized so many times it smells like a lightning strike that never ends. It tastes of dry blood and the bitter chemical tang of the amniotic fluids that leak from the Emperor's life support tanks, a fluid that smells of birth and death in equal measure. My Vox thief, buried deeper now in the masonry to avoid the increasing sweeps of the Inquisition's purifiers, has begun to vibrate with a frequency that I can only describe as a sob. It is a subsonic resonance that bypasses the ears and goes straight to the chest. A rhythmic pounding that mimics the sound of a fist hitting a locked door. This is the sound of the Webway Gate, the secret wound in the heart of the palace that the Emperor is still holding closed with his bare, psychic hands. The lost words are the sounds of the things on the other side trying to get in. I watched a group of Mechanicus deacons approach the throne with a relic they claimed was a piece of the original machinery from the master of mankind's own workshop. They were shaking so violently that the holy oil they carried spilled across the floor, leaving a trail of iridescent slickness on the black marble. They believed they were there to perform a ritual of restoration, but as I watched their mechadendrites fumbling with the ancient ports, I realized they were just as blind as the pilgrims at the gate. They weren't repairing the throne, they were feeding it. They were sacrificial lambs in red robes, their cognitive processors being drained of logic to provide a few more microseconds of stability to the Emperor's failing mind. The Vox, Thief captured the sound of their neural links snapping, a series of sharp, electric pops that sounded like the crackling of a frozen lake. When they were led away, their eyes were blank, their tongues lolling in their mouths, and the lost words they had been chanting were gone, replaced by a dull, animal lowing. They had touched the truth, and it had hollowed them out. The iron taste in my mouth became so strong I had to grit my teeth to keep from gagging. The physical pressure of the warp pushing against the palace wards is palpable now, even to those of us whose souls are shielded. It feels like a constant low, grade headache, a tightening of the skin across the knuckles, a sense of being watched by a billion eyes that are all blinking out of sync. I saw a crack form in a stained, glass window depicting the triumph of Eleanor. The crack didn't follow the lines of the lead. It tore across the face of the Emperor, a jagged lightning bolt of darkness that seemed to bleed a black, oily substance. I touched the substance and felt a coldness that went deeper than the void of space. It was the coldness of a world that has been forgotten by the sun. The Vox, Thief recorded the sound of the glass breaking. It wasn't a shatter, but a moan. The palace is no longer a fortress, it is a bandage, and the bandage is soaked through. The lost words are the instructions for what to do when the blood finally reaches the floor, but we have forgotten how to read the manual. I spent 40 years in the archives of the Forbidden Library, searching for a reference to a specific phrase the Vox, Thief had intercepted. The unspoken sanction. I found it in a scroll that was so old it turned to dust the moment I unrolled it, but I saw enough. It wasn't a law or a religious decree. It was a contingency plan for the total abandonment of the human form. The Emperor knew, even before the heresy, that the flesh would fail. He knew that the only way to survive the coming storm was to become something else, something colder and more permanent. The lost words are the blueprints for that transformation, a bridge we were supposed to cross but were too afraid to step onto. Now, the bridge is gone, and we are left staring at the far shore while the water rises around our ankles. I saw a statue of a Primarch, its face worn smooth by the touch of a billion hands, and I realized that the stone was more alive than the empire it represented. The stone was at least honest about its decay. The smell of the palace changed during the Feast of the Ascension. Usually, the scent of the millions of pilgrims is masked by the burning of rare woods and the spraying of holy water, but this year, the masks failed. The smell was one of stagnant water and old, unwashed bandages, the scent of a hospital that has become a tomb. I watched the High Lords of Terror process through the hall, their heavy velvet robes dragging through the filth on the floor, their faces painted with the white lead of false divinity. They looked like corpses being moved by wires, their eyes fixed on a point just above the horizon to avoid seeing the rot at their feet. The Vox, Thief captured their whispers, not of statecraft or war, but of petty jealousies and the price of luxury goods from the segmentum obscurus. They are the captains of a sinking ship arguing over the quality of the caviar in the dining room. The lost words are the screams they are ignoring, the sound of the whole plates buckling under the weight of the dark. I found a secret chamber behind the cooling fans of the secondary heat sinks, a place where the walls were covered in a layer of soot so thick it muffled all sound. In the center of the room was a single, ancient cogitator that was still humming with a faint, blue light. It was a weather station, meant to monitor the climate of a terror that no longer exists. It showed a world of green forests and blue oceans, a world that the Emperor had once promised to restore. I watched the data scroll past, temperature readings from 1,000 years ago, rainfall patterns from a time before the seas were boiled away. The Vox Thief recorded a soft, melodic ping from the machine as it logged a new piece of data, atmospheric failure imminent. It was talking about the palace. The very air we were breathing was being classified as a lethal environment by a machine that didn't know how to lie. The lost words are the names of the seasons we have lost: spring, summer, autumn, winter, replaced by the single, eternal season of the pyre. The vibration in my guardian spear became a constant, teeth, chattering rattle as the great rift expanded. It was as if the weapon itself was trying to warn me of a danger that I could not see. I watched a group of astropaths being led to the sacrificial chambers, their eyes sewn shut, their hands bound in silver chains. They were weeping, but not for themselves. They were weeping for the messages they had seen in the warp, messages that they were not allowed to deliver. One of them broke free and grabbed my gauntlet, his voice a frantic hiss. "The light is a lie. The light is a lure." I pushed him away, my duty overriding my curiosity, but the Vox thief had already recorded his words. I played them back in the silence of my cell and realized the terrifying truth. The Astronomicon isn't just a beacon for our ships. It's a dinner bell for the things in the dark. We are shouting into the void, and the void is finally starting to shout back. The lost words are the answers we don't want to hear. The iron taste in my mouth has become so pervasive that I can no longer remember what water tastes like. It is the taste of the palace itself, a mixture of rust, blood, and the metallic tang of the Emperor's fading will. I saw a group of servitors dismantling a wall in the Hall of Heroes to make room for more power conduits. Behind the marble, they found the remains of the original palace workers, their skeletons still clad in the rough tunics of the pre-Imperial age. They had been built into the walls, their lives used as mortar for the foundation of the Emperor's dream. The Vox thief captured the sound of the bones being crushed by the mechanical shovels, a dry, snapping sound like dead twigs. It occurred to me that we are all just mortar, my armor, my duty, my life. They are all just materials being used to patch a hole that is too big to be filled. The lost words are the names of the builders who were forgotten as soon as the roof was put on. I watched a high-ranking inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus enter the throne room, his face a mask of scarred tissue and cybernetic lenses. He knelt before the throne and emptied a bag of blackened, twisted coins onto the floor. They were the currency of a traitor world, a world that had been scarred clean by the Emperor's wrath. He was asking for a sign that the sacrifice had been worth it, that the billions of lives he had extinguished had bought us a few more years of peace. The Emperor gave no sign. The only sound was the clicking of the cooling fans and the distant, rhythmic thumping of the webway gate. The Inquisitor stayed there for 3 days, his head bowed, waiting for a whisper that never came. When he finally rose, his eyes were different. He had realized the secret of the lost words. There is no justification. There is only the survival of the machine. And the machine doesn't care about the cost of the fuel. The chapter of my testimony is lengthening, and the pressure in my skull is becoming unbearable. I can hear the Vox thief recording the sound of the Emperor's thoughts, which have become a jagged, geometric pattern of pure mathematics. He is no longer thinking in words or images. He is thinking in the language of the universe, the language of entropy and decay. He is calculating the exact moment when the last candle will flicker out, the exact second when the golden throne will finally cease to function. I saw a shadow move across the throne, a shadow that didn't belong to any of the guardians or the tech priests. It was a tall, slender shape, with eyes that burned like dying stars. It looked at me, and for a moment, I felt a sense of recognition. It wasn't an enemy, it was a witness. It was waiting for the end, just like I was. The lost words are the final script of a play that has been running for too long, and we are just the actors who have forgotten their lines. I remember the taste of the incense on the day the first High Fleet was sighted in the Segmentum Pacificus. It was a sweet, cloying smell, like rotting fruit. It was the smell of a new kind of death, a death that doesn't just kill but consumes. I watched the tactical maps in the war room flicker, with the red lights of 1,000 dying worlds. The Emperor's reaction was a sudden, violent surge of psychic energy that melted the lenses of the holographic projectors. The Vox thief recorded a sound like a great beast drawing a breath, a long, rattling inhalation that seemed to suck the very life out of the room. He was preparing for the final struggle, but it was a struggle he knew he couldn't win. The lost words are the names of the things that are coming to eat us, and the Emperor is the only one who knows how hungry they are. As this section of my record closes, I find myself looking at the throne not with awe, but with a profound, soul-crushing weariness. The iron taste, the pressure, the screaming vents, they are all parts of a singular, inescapable truth. We are the caretakers of a corpse, and the corpse is starting to wake up. But it isn't the Emperor who is waking, it is the thing he has become. A god of stone and gold, a god of silence and suffering. The lost words were the last remnants of the man he used to be, and they are being scrubbed away by the sheer weight of his divinity. I will stand my watch. I will listen to the Vox thief. But I know that the next time the Emperor speaks, it won't be in a voice that any human can understand. It will be the sound of the universe finally closing its eyes. The coolant lines that snake beneath the floor of the Sanctum Imperialis have begun to vibrate with a frequency that suggests the machinery is no longer trying to preserve a life, but is instead trying to contain an explosion. I have stood above the main arterial junction for 2 centuries, feeling the floor plates shudder beneath my magnetized soles, a rhythmic, mechanical spasm that feels like the death throes of a Leviathan. The air in this sector has taken on a secondary quality, a sharp, biting acidity that dissolves the gold leaf on the surrounding pillars and leaves a fine, white powder on the surface of my armor. It tastes of ammonia and the dry, ancient sweat of the thousands of thralls who died in the pits below, their labor fueling the very vents that now choke their descendants. My Vox thief, now encrusted with a layer of psychic frost that refuses to melt even in the heat of the fusion coils, has captured a series of erratic, high-pitched chirps. These are not malfunctions of the device. They are the sounds of the Emperor's subconscious mind, trying to reconcile 10,000 years of conflicting orders. The lost words are the fragments of the sanity he has had to discard to remain the beacon for our species. I watched a delegation of the ecclesiarchy enter the chamber during the high feast of the Emperor's mercy, their robes so heavy with gemstones and woven gold that they could barely walk. They carried a reliquary they claimed contained the unspoken commandment, a piece of parchment found in the ruins of a pre-heresy hive on Kolth. They believed it would grant them the divine authority to tax the segmentum solar into further submission. As they approached the days, the air around the throne began to warp, the light bending into a prism of bruised purples and sickly greens. The Vox thief recorded a sound like tearing silk, the sound of the Emperor's aura physically rejecting their presence. The reliquary shattered in the priest's hands, not from a blow, but from the sheer weight of the Emperor's disgust. The parchment within didn't catch fire, it simply vanished, erased from existence by a thought that found it unworthy of being remembered. The priests were thrown back by a concussive wave of ozone, their faces blackened by the discharge. The lost words are the truths that the Church cannot possess, for to possess them would be to realize that the God they worship finds them repulsive. The iron taste in my mouth became so intense I could feel it in the roots of my teeth, a metallic warning of a god's patience reaching its absolute limit. The structural integrity of the palace's lower foundations has reached a point of critical instability that the administratum hides behind a wall of redacted reports. I have seen the way the mountains themselves are bowing under the weight of the hive, cities built upon their peaks. I saw a crack open in the floor of the hall of 1,000 columns, a fissure that went down so deep that the heat rising from it smelled of the planet's molten core. I leaned over the edge and heard a sound that the Vox thief struggled to process, a low, melodic humming that seemed to be coming from the earth itself. It was the sound of terror trying to shake us off. The lost words are the planetary death rattles we mistake for the background noise of the city. We have turned the cradle of humanity into a cage, and the cage is starting to buckle. I watched a group of laborers trying to fill the fissure with liquid lead, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of the chasm, and I realized they were just pouring salt into a wound. The palace is a parasite that has grown larger than its host, and the host is finally dying. The pressure in my skull has shifted from a dull ache to a sharp, localized stabbing behind the eyes, a symptom of the warp static becoming more coherent. I have begun to see the lost words, written in the frost that forms on the cooling pipes. They are symbols that do not belong to any known human alphabet, a linguistic geometry that describes the anatomy of the soul. I spent 3 decades trying to transcribe a single sequence that appeared on the main coolant reservoir. When I finally matched it against the forbidden lexicons in the deep vaults, I found it was a mathematical formula for the evaporation of a spirit. The Emperor isn't just suffering, he is evaporating. Every miracle he performs, every ship he guides, every soul he protects is a drop of his own essence being cast into the void. The lost words are the records of his shrinking borders. I saw a Sister of Silence standing near the reservoir, her hand resting on the frosted pipe, and for a moment the symbols vanished. She looked at me, her eyes full of a cold, clear pity, and I knew she could see the formula too. We are guarding a reservoir that is almost empty. The smell of the palace after the solstice of sorrows was one of ancient, stale incense and the metallic tang of a dying battery. The atmospheric scrubbers had failed in the southern spire, and the air was thick with the scent of the underhive, a mixture of recycled waste, chemical runoff, and the desperate, unwashed smell of a billion souls living in the dark. I watched the High Lords convene in the shadow of the throne, their voices hushed as they discussed the logistics of the latest Black Crusade. They spoke of millions of casualties, as if they were nothing more than rounding errors in a ledger. The Vox thief captured the sound of their pens scratching on vellum, a sound that seemed to echo the rhythmic grinding of the throne's life support pumps. They are the scribes of a tragedy they refuse to read. The lost words are the names of the worlds they have already abandoned, the places where the light has already gone out. I saw a map of the galaxy projected in the center of the hall, and as I watched, entire sectors flickered from gold to a dull, bruised red. The Emperor's reach is pulling back, drawing his remaining strength into a tight, defensive knot around the heart of the Imperium. I found an abandoned scriptorium in the sub-levels of the palace that had been sealed since the age of apostasy. Inside, the walls were covered in the skeletons of scribes who had died at their desks, their fingers still clutching their quills. They had been transcribing the Emperor's telepathic broadcasts during a period of intense warp storms. I picked up a page that had been preserved by the dry, oxygen-free air and read the words. It wasn't a command or a prayer. It was a poem, a long, rambling lament for the beauty of a sunrise on a world that no longer exists. The Vox thief recorded a soft, static-filled sigh as I touched the paper. It was the sound of the palace remembering its own youth. The lost words are the memories of peace that the Emperor can no longer afford to keep. To be the protector of mankind, he has had to become a monster of pure logic, cutting away his own humanity like a gangrenous limb. I left the scriptorium and sealed the door, leaving the skeletons to guard the last beautiful thing in the palace. The vibration in my guardian spear has become so violent that I have had to wrap the haft in leather to keep the friction from burning my palms. It is a warning of an imminent breach, not in the physical walls, but in the psychic fabric of the room. I watched a group of psychers being led into the soul, binding chambers, their bodies shriveled and grey, their minds already shattered by the proximity of the throne. They were singing a high, discordant melody that made the air shimmer with a pale, ghostly light. The Vox thief recorded their song, and when I slowed it down, I realized it was a countdown, not in seconds or minutes, but in heartbeats. The Emperor is counting down the remaining life force of the human race. The lost words are the final numbers in a calculation that ends in 0. I saw a tech priest adjusting the intake valves on the sacrificial pods. His movements mechanical and precise, and I wondered if he knew he was the executioner of his own species. The taste of the air has become thick with the flavor of burnt hair and ozone. The scent of the Emperor's psychic shield straining to the point of failure. I saw a spark of warp fire ignite on the hem of a banner, a tiny, flickering flame of emerald and violet that refused to be extinguished by the ventilation fans. It was a breach, a pinprick in the reality of the room. I watched the flame grow, eating through the ancient fabric until it formed a hole that looked out into the screaming madness of the warp. The Vox thief captured the sound of the breach, a high-pitched, mocking laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The lost words are the taunts of the things on the other side, the promises they make to the dying. I stepped forward and crushed the flame with my gauntlet, the coldness of the warp searing through my armor, but the hole remained in my mind. The palace is no longer a sanctuary, it is a sieve. I recall a day when the vibrations of the machinery beneath the throne changed to a rhythmic, thudding sound, like a giant heart trying to beat in a vacuum. It was the sound of the webway gate's secondary seals failing. The tech priests rushed to the site, their mechadendrites weaving a complex pattern of protective runes in the air. But I could see the terror in their optical sensors. They were trying to patch a hole in the universe with pieces of scrap metal and prayers. The Vox thief picked up a sequence of numbers being broadcast by the throne, a series of coordinates for worlds that were lost 10,000 years ago. The Emperor was trying to find a way out, a path that had been closed to him since the betrayal of Magnus. The lost words are the map to a paradise that has been turned into a hell. I watched the priests work until they collapsed from the psychic feedback, their bodies twitching on the cold floor, and I realized that we are all just trying to hold back the tide with our bare hands. The pressure in my skull has reached a point where I can no longer hear the sound of my own voice. I think in the language of the Vox thief now, in bursts of static and binary code. I see the world as a series of failing systems and diminishing returns. I watched a young novice of the Custodes take his first watch near the outer gate, his armor shining and his eyes full of a fanatical, blinding light. He still believed in the dream. He still thought the lost words would be a command for a new crusade. I wanted to tell him the truth, to tell him that the words are already spoken and the command is, die well, but the rules of our order forbid it. We must be the symbols of a hope we no longer feel. The lost words are the secrets we keep from our brothers to keep them standing. I turned away from him and focused on the flickering light of the throne, the iron taste in my mouth becoming a permanent, bitter companion. As the fourth chapter of my record ends, the darkness in the corners of the room has become a physical presence, a thick, cloying shadow that refuses to be pushed back by the lumen strips. The lost words are the whispers in that shadow, the voices of the fallen who are waiting for us to join them. I can hear the Vox thief clicking in the dark, its battery almost dead, its memory banks full of the sounds of a dying god. The Emperor is silent now, his mind focused entirely on the struggle to keep the gate closed for one more second, one more heartbeat. I look at my guardian spear, the gold blackened by psychic frost, and I realize that I am no longer guarding a throne. I am guarding a tombstone. The lost words were the last testament of a man who tried to save the world and only succeeded in making its death last forever. I will continue my watch, but I know that the next sound I hear will not be a word. It will be the sound of the door finally opening. The secondary coolant reservoirs beneath the Eternity Gate finally gave way during the final century of my vigil, flooding the sub-foundations with a viscous, radioactive sludge that smells of ozone and ancient, stagnant copper. I stood in the rising tide of that filth for 30 years, my armor's seals groaning under the corrosive pressure, watching the golden light of the throne room reflect off the surface of a liquid that was effectively the Emperor's cooling blood. The air has become a solid weight now, a pressurized gas composed of incense ash, metal vapor, and the psychic exhaust of a mind that has been burning for 10,000 years. It tastes of cold iron and the bitter, electric tang of a world that has forgotten how to breathe without the aid of a machine. My vox thief, now almost entirely consumed by the black rust of the palace's hidden cankers, has ceased its rhythmic clicking. In its place, it has begun to broadcast a single, continuous note, a low, mournful vibration that resonates with the structural steel of the palace itself. This is the sound of the final, lost word. It is not a phrase nor a command, but a frequency of departure. The Emperor is not just speaking his end, he is tuning the universe to the silence that will follow his passing. I watched the final congregation of the High Lords before the great solar flare, a gathering of withered husks in robes of woven solar filaments. They moved with the slow, deliberate grace of puppets whose strings are fraying in a high wind. They did not come to the throne for guidance. They came to see if the gold was still there. They checked the tithe, ledgers and the fuel, flow regulators, their eyes never once rising to the face of the being who made their existence possible. The vox thief captured the sound of their shallow, fearful breathing, a chorus of gasps that sounded like the dry rattling of dice in a box. They are the accountants of a bankrupt reality, frantically moving numbers from one column to another to hide the fact that the total is zero. The lost words are the truths they have deleted from the ledgers, the date of the throne's total failure, the number of systems already lost to the shadow, and the terrifying realization that there is no plan for what happens when the light goes out. The iron taste in my mouth became so thick I could no longer swallow. A physical manifestation of the silence I was forced to maintain, while the leaders of my species discussed the price of the nails for our collective coffin. The physical pressure of the palace's collapse has moved from the foundations to the very soul of the structure. I have seen the walls of the sanctum sanctorum bleed, not the metaphorical blood of martyrs, but a literal, dark echo that seeps from the porous stone. It is the concentrated sorrow of 10 millennia, a liquid grief that pools in the corners of the room and reflects the flickering amber of the failing power cells. I touched a smear of it on a column and felt 1,000 years of screams pass through my gauntlet in a single second. The lost words are the names of everyone who has ever died in the Emperor's name, a list so long it has become a physical substance that is slowly drowning the palace. I watched a group of cherubs, their mechanical wings sparking and stuttering, trying to clean the echo from the floor with brushes made of human hair. They were failing. The stains are permanent. The history of the Imperium is written in a fluid that can never be washed away. We are standing in a lake of our own blood, waiting for the tide to go out. The pressure in my skull has reached a state of equilibrium, a constant, high-pitched scream that I have come to accept as the natural sound of the universe. I no longer see the room through the lenses of my helmet. I see it through the psychic feedback of the throne itself. The world is a web of fraying gold threads, each one representing a life, a ship, a world held in place by the Emperor's straining will. I have begun to see the lost words as the gaps between those threads. They are the silences where God used to be. I spent a decade watching a single thread unravel, a sub-sector on the edge of the segmentum tempestus. As the thread snapped, I heard the vox thief emit a sound like a distant bell tolling in a fog. It was the sound of 1,000,000 souls being extinguished in a single breath. The Emperor didn't flinch. He couldn't. He has become a statue of pure focus, a mind that has had to sacrifice the ability to feel in order to maintain the ability to act. The lost words are the emotions he has discarded, the love, the fear, the hope, leaving behind only the cold, hard logic of the machine. The smell of the palace in these final days is the smell of a sun that is being extinguished by its own ash. The incense has lost its sweetness, replaced by the acrid stench of burning hair and the metallic odor of a failing fusion reactor. I watched the Sisters of Silence depart the chamber for the last time, their blank fields flickering like dying candles. Without them, the psychic weight of the room became an agonizing physical force, a hammer that beat against my chest until my lungs began to bleed. The Vox thief captured the sound of the silence they left behind, a hollow, echoing void that felt like a predator waiting in the dark. The lost words are the screams that the sisters were meant to suppress, the voices of the warp that are now shouting directly into our minds. I saw a master servitor collapse under the weight of the silence, its brain liquefying and leaking from its ears as it tried to process the unfiltered reality of the Emperor's suffering. We are all servitors now, waiting for the command to stop. I found a hidden alcove behind the primary logic engines where the air was still and cold. Inside was a single, hand-written scroll protected by a stasis field that was mere hours from failing. It was written in the Emperor's own hand, from a time before the throne, before the crusade, before the dream had been twisted into a nightmare. It was a simple list of things he missed about being a man. The smell of rain on dry earth, the sound of a child laughing, the taste of fresh bread. The lost words are these mundane, beautiful things that the master of mankind can no longer remember. He has traded his humanity for a crown of thorns that spans the galaxy, and the trade has left him with nothing but the thorns. The Vox thief recorded a soft, static, heavy sob as the stasis field finally failed and the scroll crumbled into dust. It was the sound of the last human thought in the palace being erased. I stood in the dark, the dust of the Emperor's memories coating my armor, and I realized that we have won the war, but lost the reason for fighting it. The vibration in my guardian spear has stabilized into a low, rhythmic thrum that matches the heartbeat of the Golden Throne. We are now one machine, a single organism of gold and suffering. I watched the last of the pilgrims being turned away from the outer gates, their faces pale and desperate as the great iron doors were sealed for the final time. The Vox thief captured the sound of the locks clicking home, a sound like a coffin being nailed shut. The palace is now a tomb, and we are the funerary statues meant to watch over the body. The lost words are the prayers of those pilgrims, prayers that will never be heard because the one they were meant for is busy holding the stars in the sky. I saw a young girl leave a single, withered flower at the foot of the gate before she was swept away by the crowd. The flower was crushed by a tank, tread within seconds. That is the truth of the lost words. They are the small, fragile hopes that are being ground into the dirt by the machinery of our survival. The taste of the air is now entirely metallic, a mixture of lead and mercury that coats the back of the throat and makes the tongue feel like a piece of dead iron. I saw a spark of pure, white light arc from the throne to the ceiling, carving a path of destruction through the ancient tapestries. It was a discharge of pure psychic frustration, a scream made of light. The Vox thief captured the frequency of the arc, a sound like 1,000 mirrors shattering at once. The lost words are the pieces of those mirrors, the fragmented reflections of a future that will never happen. I watched the tech priests try to extinguish the fires with chemical foam. But the fires weren't burning the fabric. They were burning the concept of the fabric. They were erasing the history the tapestries depicted. We are losing our past as quickly as we are losing our future. I recall the moment the vibrations of the palace changed for the last time. It wasn't a sound of failure, but a sound of release. The heavy, grinding tension that had defined my life for 10,000 years suddenly vanished, replaced by a terrifying, weightless silence. It was the moment the Emperor stopped trying to save us and started trying to finish us. The lost words are the final instructions for the dismantling of the Imperium, a systematic shutdown of every gate, every forge, and every beacon. He is pulling the plug on a universe that has become too painful to inhabit. The Vox thief captured a final transmission, a string of binary that translated to a single word: enough. It wasn't a command to the Guard or the Navy, it was a command to himself. He has had enough of the gold, enough of the blood, and enough of the lies. He is ready to go into the dark, and he is taking us with him. The pressure in my skull has vanished, replaced by a clarity that is more terrifying than any madness. I see the palace for what it is, a hollow shell of gold around a void of suffering. I see the lost words, written on the faces of my brothers. A shared understanding that the watch is finally over. I watched the sun set over the spires of terror for what I knew would be the last time, the light turning a bruised, bloody red before being swallowed by the toxic smog of the hive levels. The Vox thief is dead now, its circuits fried by the final surge of the throne. I am the only record left. The lost words are the things I am telling you now. The testimony of a witness who saw the light go out and realized it was never really there to begin with. We were worshipping a shadow, and the shadow has finally grown large enough to consume the world. As this final chapter of my record ends, I feel a sense of profound, soul-chilling peace. The iron taste is gone. The pressure is gone. The screaming has stopped. There is only the silence of the throne room, a silence so deep it feels like the bottom of the ocean. The lost words have all been spoken, and there is nothing left to say. I look at the Emperor, at the withered thing on the golden throne, and I see him smile. It is a terrible, beautiful smile. The smile of a man who has finally been allowed to sleep. The doors of the sanctum are opening, and the dark is coming in. I will not raise my spear. I will not shout a warning. I will simply stand here and watch the end of the world, for I am the guardian of the final truth. The Emperor's lost words were never a secret to be found. They were a silence to be earned, and we have earned it.